What if you disappeared from a crowded shelter in the middle of winter and no one realized you were gone for weeks? What if your last known location was surrounded by people, yet somehow you simply vanished into the Montana cold without a trace? This is the haunting reality of Melissa Ruth Arnold's disappearance. On a frigid February day in 2018, a 37-year-old woman walked out of a homeless shelter in Missoula, Montana, and was never seen alive again. For over 4.5 years, her family searched. They prayed. They hoped. And in the autumn of 2022, a hunter walking through the remote wilderness between Quinn's Hot Springs and St. Regis made a discovery that would finally bring some answers, but also raise even more questions. This is the story of Melissa Arnold, a daughter, a sister, a woman who faced tremendous challenges but never lost her family's love. Her case exposes the vulnerability of those living on society's margins and the devastating reality that someone can vanish from a busy shelter filled with people, and weeks can pass before anyone sounds the alarm. Tonight, we examine every detail of this tragic case. From Melissa's last known moments at the Poverello Center to the discovery that would bring her family's worst fears to reality. We'll explore the investigation, the theories, and the questions that still haunt this case today. Before Melissa Arnold became a missing person case number. Before her face appeared on flyers throughout western Montana. She was simply Mel, a woman who loved to cook, embraced adventure, and meant everything to her family. Melissa's sister, Sherelle Mendenhall, remembers her as caring, adventurous, and a good cook. In a 2022 interview with MTN News, Sherelle shared a tender childhood memory. "I remember when we were little, for some reason, she climbed in my bunk bed with me. And I remember looking up at the ceiling and not wanting to move because I didn't want to wake her up." These small, intimate moments paint a picture of Melissa that's easily lost when someone becomes a statistic, when they're reduced to a case file or a missing person poster. Melissa was real. She had people who loved her deeply. Born on August 24, 1980, Melissa Ruth Arnold stood just 5 feet 2 inches tall, with blonde hair and striking blue eyes. She had a pierced lower lip and a tattoo on her upper arm. According to official reports, she went by the nickname Mel and occasionally used the last names Doherty and Smith, likely from previous relationships or marriages. By 2018, Melissa was facing one of life's most difficult challenges, homelessness. But unlike the stereotype many people hold of those experiencing homelessness, Melissa wasn't disconnected from her family. She maintained semi-regular contact with her father, who helped with some of her needs. This detail is crucial to understanding her case. Melissa had people who cared about her welfare, who stayed in touch with her, who would notice if she went silent. In February 2018, Missoula, Montana was grappling with a homelessness crisis. A community-wide survey found that the city of Missoula had 293 homeless individuals, representing 23% of the estimated total homeless population in the state, the highest percentage anywhere in Montana. The Poverello Center, Missoula's main homeless shelter, was overwhelmed. On a frigid night in February, 205 people slept in every nook and cranny of the Poverello Center homeless shelter, prompting overwhelmed staff to revise their limits to 150 people on warm nights and 175 on cold nights. The Poverello Center, known locally as the POV, has been Missoula's safety net for the homeless since 1974. Located on West Broadway, it provides emergency shelter, hot meals, clothing, and essential services to those in need. For many experiencing homelessness in Missoula, it's not just a shelter, it's a lifeline, a place of dignity in desperate circumstances. This was Melissa's world in February 2018, a world of crowded shelters, bitter Montana winters, and the daily struggle of life without stable housing. But it was also a world where she had her father checking on her, staff who saw her regularly, and a community of others experiencing similar struggles. In this context, Melissa Arnold's life continued day by day until February 19, 2018. When everything changed, February 19, 2018, a Monday in Missoula, Montana. Winter still held the region in its grip, with temperatures hovering in the low 30s during the day and plunging well below freezing at night. For those with homes, it was an inconvenience. For those like Melissa Arnold, it was a matter of survival. Arnold was last seen at the Poverello Center, a homeless shelter in Missoula, Montana, during the daytime on February 19, 2018. Let that sink in for a moment. During the daytime, at a crowded shelter, surrounded by people. This wasn't the middle of the night when she might have slipped away unnoticed. This was during operating hours at one of the busiest periods in the shelter's history. Yet somehow, Melissa walked out of the Poverello Center that day and was never seen again. What was that day like for Melissa? We can reconstruct some of it based on the typical operations of the Poverello Center. The shelter serves a continental breakfast from 4 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. daily, followed by hot lunch and dinner. Melissa would have had access to these meals. She would have been surrounded by other shelter residents, staff members, volunteers. But here's what we don't know. And what makes this case so challenging? We don't know what time exactly Melissa was last seen. We don't know who she might have been with. We don't know if she told anyone where she was going. We don't have a final conversation, a last interaction, a moment that in retrospect would become significant. What we know is this. Melissa was at the Poverello Center during the day on February 19, 2018. And then she wasn't. Did she leave intending to return? The Poverello Center isn't a locked facility. Residents can come and go. Many leave during the day to look for work, run errands, or simply to have some time away from the crowded conditions. Was this just another routine departure that somehow became permanent? Did she leave with someone? Meet someone outside? Have a destination in mind? According to information from online sources, Melissa made her last public Facebook post on February 20, 2018, one day after she was last seen at the shelter. This detail is intriguing. If accurate, it means that at some point after leaving the Poverello Center on the 19th, Melissa had access to the internet and posted something to social media. Where was she when she made that post? Was she safe? Did that post contain any clues about her state of mind or whereabouts? Unfortunately, the specific content of that final post hasn't been made public, so we can't analyze it for potential leads. What's particularly tragic about Melissa's disappearance is the time that elapsed before it was recognized as such. Her father reported her missing after several weeks passed without his hearing from her. Several weeks. Not days, weeks. This delay isn't unusual in cases involving homeless individuals, and it's not an indication of anyone's negligence. The reality of life on the streets means irregular communication patterns. A week without contact might not be alarming. 2 weeks might raise some concern, but could be explained. But eventually, Melissa's father reached the point where his worry overcame any rational explanation, and he contacted the Missoula Police Department. By the time the missing person report was filed, the trail was already cold. Whatever happened to Melissa on or shortly after February 19th had occurred weeks earlier. Any potential witnesses would be harder to locate. Security footage, if any existed, might have been overwritten. The immediacy that's so crucial in missing person investigations had been lost. Her father told police. He has not heard from Arnold in several weeks. For a father who had been his daughter's support system during her struggles with homelessness, this silence must have been deafening. On February 28, 2018, 9 days after Melissa was last seen, the Missoula Police Department released a public statement. The department was investigating the report of a missing person, identified as 37-year-old Melissa Arnold. last seen in Missoula on or around the 19th of February 2018. Described as a white female with blonde hair and a pierced lower lip. The case was assigned to Detective Mitch Lang. Detective Lang wanted to check her welfare and make sure she was okay. At this point, the investigation was still in its early stages, and there was hope that Melissa might simply be somewhere safe. Unable or unwilling to make contact, but as any detective will tell you, the first 48 hours are critical in a missing person case. In Melissa's case, those critical hours had long since passed. It was just devastating. Life stopped, Melissa's sister Sherelle Mendenhall said of her sister's disappearance. For the Arnold family, February 19, 2018, marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. Unlike missing person cases that generate immediate media frenzy and public attention, Melissa's disappearance received relatively limited coverage initially. This is, unfortunately, a common pattern when the missing person is homeless. Despite the fact that homeless individuals face significantly higher risks of violence, exploitation, and death, their cases often don't generate the same level of public concern or media attention as missing people from stable housing situations. This phenomenon even has a name in criminology and journalism circles: missing white woman syndrome. Though that term typically refers to the disproportionate coverage given to attractive, young, upper-middle-class white women. Melissa was white, but she was homeless, which placed her in a different category in terms of public attention and resource allocation, yet to her family. Melissa wasn't a statistic or a social problem. She was a beloved sister, daughter, and family member whose absence left a gaping hole in their lives. The Missoula Police Department, to their credit, took the case seriously. I do know that the Missoula Police Department investigated this case very thoroughly back in 2018, and then when additional leads or tips came in, those were also investigated. Mendenhall recalled, but investigating the disappearance of a homeless person presents unique challenges. Melissa didn't have a permanent address to check. She didn't have a regular workplace where coworkers might notice her absence. Her daily routine involved moving between the shelter and various locations around Missoula. Her social circle consisted largely of other homeless individuals who, themselves, might be transient or difficult to locate for interviews. The Poverello Center staff would have been interviewed. Did anyone remember seeing Melissa leave that day? Did she seem upset or worried? Had she mentioned any plans or destinations? Was she with anyone? Other shelter residents would have been potential witnesses, but tracking down individuals in the homeless community for follow-up interviews is challenging. People move on, leave town, or may be reluctant to talk to police for various reasons. The investigation likely included checking local hospitals and jails, standard procedure in missing person cases, especially when the missing person is vulnerable. Had Melissa been injured or arrested under a different name? Had she sought medical care somewhere? Detective Lang and his team would have canvassed areas where homeless individuals congregated. They would have checked with other social service agencies. They would have reviewed any available security camera footage from businesses near the Poverello Center or other locations Melissa might have frequented. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the case grew colder. There were no confirmed sightings after February 19th. No use of any ID or benefits. No contact with family. No activity on social media after that February 20th post. Melissa Arnold had simply vanished. For Melissa's mother, Kim Smith, the uncertainty was perhaps the most agonizing aspect. I had a sense of peace because I felt like God kinda let me know that she's with him, for me. But I kind of put it in a category and had to do that to be able to do life, Smith told reporters in 2022. Describing how she'd had to find a way to cope with her daughter's disappearance. The Arnold family did what families of the missing do. They kept hoping, kept searching, kept Melissa's case alive however they could. They shared information on social media. They talked to anyone who might have seen her. They waited for the phone call that might bring news, good or bad, and they waited. And waited. Months turned into a year. Then 2 years. Then 3. The case remained officially open, but with no new leads, there was little active investigation. Melissa Arnold's disappearance had become a cold case until June 2022, when everything changed. From February 2018 through early 2022, Melissa Arnold's case existed in a difficult limbo. She was listed as a missing person in Montana's Missing Persons Database, maintained by the Department of Justice. Her case file sat with the Missoula Police Department, officially open but with no active leads to pursue. This period, what we might call the cold case years, represents a particularly painful chapter for missing persons families. The initial flurry of investigation activity has ended. Media attention has moved on to newer cases. The daily urgency that characterized the first weeks of the investigation has given way to a grim, uncertain waiting. But let's examine what investigators knew and what theories they might have been working with during this period. Theory 1. Voluntary disappearance. One possibility that investigators always must consider is that Melissa chose to disappear. People experiencing homelessness sometimes decide to leave an area, perhaps seeking better opportunities elsewhere, wanting a fresh start, or fleeing from something or someone. However, several factors made this theory unlikely in Melissa's case. First, she maintained semi-regular contact with her father, who helped with some of her needs. This relationship suggested someone who, despite her circumstances, maintained family connections and wasn't trying to cut ties completely. Second, there was no indication Melissa had the resources to relocate. She didn't have a vehicle registered in her name. She didn't have the kind of financial resources that would enable travel and relocation. While it's certainly possible to hitchhike or find other means of transport, there was no evidence suggesting she had planned such a move. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was no contact whatsoever after her disappearance. No phone call months later saying she was safe. No social media activity. No use of identification or benefits in another state. Complete silence. Theory 2. Victim of foul play. Given Melissa's vulnerability as a homeless woman, investigators certainly would have considered the possibility that she became the victim of violence. Homeless individuals face significantly elevated risks of assault, robbery, and murder. Was there someone who might have wanted to harm Melissa? Did she have conflicts with anyone at the shelter or in the homeless community? Had she been in an abusive relationship? Was there any evidence of threats against her? These are the kinds of questions detectives would have explored. Unfortunately, the passage of several weeks between Melissa's disappearance and the filing of the missing person report would have made investigating these possibilities more challenging. Investigators would have looked at any individuals Melissa had contact within the days before her disappearance. Were there any concerning interactions? Any red flags? They would have checked for similar cases, other missing persons, or unsolved homicides in the Missoula area that might share characteristics with Melissa's disappearance. Theory 3. Accident or exposure. Montana. Winters are brutally cold, especially at night. For someone experiencing homelessness, the risk of death from exposure is very real. Could Melissa have left the shelter and become disoriented, injured, or incapacitated by the cold? This theory had to be considered, particularly given the timing of her disappearance in February, one of the coldest months in Montana. On a frigid night in February, 205 people slept in every nook and cranny of the Poverello Center homeless shelter, which gives you a sense of how desperate people were to get out of the cold. However, Missoula isn't a massive wilderness area. If Melissa had suffered exposure death within the city limits or even in the nearby areas, one would expect her body to have been discovered relatively quickly especially as winter gave way to spring and summer, when more people would be outdoors. Theory 4. Medical emergency. Could Melissa have suffered a medical emergency, a stroke, heart attack, seizure, or other acute medical event that incapacitated her? This was possible, though again, the question remained, where did this happen, and why wasn't she found? Investigators would have checked with all area hospitals and medical facilities. They would have checked the county morgue for any unidentified bodies. The challenge of investigating homelessness-related disappearances. What made Melissa's case particularly challenging was the intersection of homelessness and missing persons investigation. Homeless individuals often don't have the same paper trails that housed individuals do. They may not have regular access to phones or internet. They may not have consistent medical records, financial records, or other documentation that can help establish timelines and patterns. Moreover, the transient nature of homelessness means that potential witnesses themselves may be difficult to locate and re-interview as the investigation progresses. Someone who was staying at the Poverello Center in February 2018 might be in a different city or state by the time detectives want to follow up months later. The homeless community also faces barriers to cooperation with law enforcement. Some individuals experiencing homelessness have outstanding warrants or other reasons to avoid police contact. Some have had negative experiences with law enforcement in the past. Building trust and getting cooperation in investigations can be challenging. The family's perspective throughout these cold case years. Melissa's family never gave up hope of finding answers. They maintained her presence on social media. They kept in touch with the Missoula Police Department. They waited for any news, anything that might explain where Melissa was and what had happened to her. Sherelle said at the beginning of 2022, her prayer was for answers. After 4 years of uncertainty, the family was desperate for any information that might provide closure. Then, in June 2022, that prayer was partially answered, though not in the way the family had hoped. June 2022, more than 4 years after Melissa Arnold's disappearance. The case had long since gone cold, relegated to the files of unsolved missing persons cases. Then, in a remote area near St. Regis, Montana, approximately 60 miles northwest of Missoula, someone made a discovery that would finally break the silence. In June 2022, Arnold's wallet, identification, pants and knife were found in the vicinity of Dolan Flats and the Clark Fork River Lodge near St. Regis, Montana. Let that sink in for a moment. More than 4 years after Melissa vanished from Missoula, her personal belongings turned up in Sanders County, in an area quite distant from where she was last seen. The location is significant. St. Regis is a small, unincorporated community in Sanders County, Montana. It sits along Interstate 90 and is known primarily as a stop for travelers and as a gateway to outdoor recreation areas. The Clark Fork River runs through the area, and the region is characterized by mountainous terrain, dense forests, and relatively sparse population. Dolan Flats and the Clark Fork River Lodge are even more remote, not bustling tourist areas, but rather isolated spots along the river. The kind of places where you might go fishing or hiking, but not places someone experiencing homelessness would typically have reason to be, especially in winter. How did Melissa's belongings end up there? This question would drive the next phase of the investigation. When those personal belongings were discovered, a detective from MPD went out to that location and collected the items, Mendenhall recalled. The items were immediately sent to the Montana State Crime Lab for forensic testing. For the Arnold family, this discovery brought a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was the first tangible clue in over 4 years, something concrete, something real that might lead to answers. On the other hand, the location and circumstances were deeply troubling. As soon as her disappearance happened and we lost all communication, 4.5 years went by, and we have heard nothing. It has been a cold case. So, to have any sort of anything is a miracle. It's a blessing. It's something that has led us all to come here because it's given us a renewed sense of hope for answers, said Arnold's sister, Sherelle Mendenhall. But when you rip that back open, it's like everything floods back to the surface and you just are grieving all over again. And all of us are right back in the midst of that pain, said Arnold's mother, Kim Smith. The family refused to give up. They created a Facebook page to coordinate search efforts and share information. They organized a volunteer search of the area where Melissa's belongings had been found, Mendenhall. And some of Melissa's other family members organized a search this weekend with the help of more than 40 volunteers. The search focused on the Clark Fork River area near St. Regis, according to reports. The effort included a dive team and boats, overwhelming support and love of just, "Hey, you guys are going through hell. Let me try and help," Mendenhall said, describing the community response to their search efforts. This grassroots search effort demonstrated the family's determination and the community's compassion. For a weekend in July 2022, more than 40 people gave their time to search for any trace of Melissa Arnold in the rugged terrain around St. Regis. But the question remained, what would they find? Had Melissa somehow made it to Sanders County before meeting with foul play or an accident? Or had her belongings been moved there, separated from her body? The answers would come, but not for several more months, in autumn 2022. As the leaves changed color and hunters took to the woods for fall hunting season, someone made a discovery in that same general area, a discovery that would finally provide some answers, even as it raised new questions. Autumn 2022. Hunting season in Montana. A hunter walking through the wilderness in Sanders County, somewhere in the remote stretch between Quinn's Hot Springs Resort and St. Regis, came across something that would crack open a 4.5-year-old cold case. Human remains in the autumn of 2022. Her remains were found by a hunter in Sanders County, Montana. Between Quinn's Hot Springs Resort and St. Regis, the location deserves careful examination. Quinn's Hot Springs Resort is a well-known destination located on Montana Highway 135, nestled in a canyon along the Clark Fork River. It's a beautiful area, the kind of place people visit to relax in natural hot springs, surrounded by stunning mountain scenery. But beautiful doesn't mean accessible. The area between Quinn's Hot Springs and St. Regis is characterized by dense forest, steep terrain, and limited access. Highway 135 winds through this canyon, with the Clark Fork River on one side and mountains rising on the other. Train tracks run along the river. There are pockets of development, the resort itself. A few scattered properties, but much of the area is wilderness. This is not the kind of place someone experiencing homelessness would typically be, especially not in winter. There's no shelter here, no services, no access to the resources someone in Melissa's situation would need. The remoteness of the location would become a key piece of the puzzle investigators had to solve. The Sanders County coroner confirms a hunter made the discovery late last Friday. Authorities responded on Saturday and recovered the remains on Sunday. The recovery of human remains in wilderness areas is a delicate, methodical process. Law enforcement and coroner's investigators had to carefully document the scene, photograph everything in situ, and then painstakingly recover the remains and any associated evidence, given that the remains had been exposed to the elements for potentially years. Their condition would have been significantly deteriorated. Montana's weather cycles from bitter winters to hot summers, along with wildlife activity and natural decomposition, would have left little behind. Sanders County Coroner Patrick Barber said a hunter found the remains in an area between Quinn's Hot Springs Resort and St. Regis. The remains were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The immediate questions were, Whose remains were these? How long had they been there? And what was the cause of death? In cases of skeletal remains or significantly decomposed bodies, identification can be challenging. Traditional methods like fingerprints or visual identification are often not possible. Investigators must turn to other methods: dental records, DNA analysis, or identifying characteristics like old bone fractures or surgical implants. For months, remains remained unidentified. The Arnold family, already reeling from the discovery of Melissa's belongings in the area just months earlier, waited anxiously for confirmation of what they already suspected in their hearts. The Sanders County Coroner's Office worked with state agencies to identify the human remains found by a hunter. Finally, in March 2023, nearly 5 years after Melissa, Arnold walked out of the Poverello Center and disappeared. The identification was confirmed in March 2023. They were identified as Arnold's using DNA testing. The remains found in that remote stretch of Sanders County wilderness were those of Melissa Ruth Arnold, for the Arnold family. This brought the closure of knowing what happened to Melissa, even as it opened new questions about how and why she ended up in that remote location. Her death is under investigation. According to the Charley Project, which tracks missing persons cases, the wording here is significant. Not her death has been ruled an accident or her death has been ruled natural causes. Her death is under investigation. This suggests that authorities have not yet determined or are not publicly stating the circumstances of Melissa's death. Was it foul play? An accident? Exposure? Suicide? The investigation continues, and as of now, no official determination has been made public regarding the cause and manner of Melissa Arnold's death. What we know for certain is this: Melissa Arnold disappeared from Missoula, Montana, in February 2018. Her belongings were found in June 2022 near St. Regis, in Sanders County. Her remains were found in autumn 2022 in the same general area. Those remains were positively identified as hers in March 2023. Everything else, how she got there, what happened to her, why she ended up in that particular location, remains a matter of investigation and speculation. Now that we know, Melissa Arnold died in Sanders County, Montana, likely sometime after her disappearance in February 2018. We must examine the possible scenarios that could explain her fate. While the investigation continues and no official determination has been made public, we can analyze the available evidence and consider the various theories. Theory 1. Fatal accident or exposure. One possibility is that Melissa traveled to the St. Regis Quinns Hot Springs area for some reason and suffered a fatal accident, or died from exposure to the elements. The region where her remains were found is remote and rugged. The Clark Fork River runs through the area, and there are numerous ways someone could have an accident: falling from a trail, slipping into the river, becoming disoriented in the wilderness. In February 2018, temperatures in Montana were brutally cold. If Melissa somehow ended up in this remote area without adequate shelter or clothing, death from hypothermia would have been a very real possibility. However, this theory faces several significant challenges. First, how did Melissa get to Sanders County? It's approximately 60 miles from Missoula to the area where her remains were found. She didn't have a vehicle. Did she hitchhike? If so, why? What reason would she have had to go to this remote area? Second, the timing is puzzling. She was last seen at the Poverello Center during the day on February 19th. If she left Missoula that day and traveled to Sanders County, what happened in between? Did she stay somewhere else first? The discovery location isn't exactly along a main route or near obvious destinations. Third, Quinns Hot Springs Resort and the surrounding area aren't places where homeless individuals typically go. The resort is expensive. The area doesn't offer the social services or resources someone in Melissa's situation would need. There's no homeless shelter there, no soup kitchen, no social services. Still, accidents happen. Perhaps Melissa accepted a ride from someone heading that direction. Perhaps she knew someone in the area. Perhaps she had some reason unknown to her family and investigators to go there. Theory 2. Foul play by acquaintance. Another possibility that must be considered is that someone Melissa knew was responsible for her death. Did Melissa leave the Poverello Center with someone on February 19th? Someone she trusted, perhaps someone offering her a ride or a place to stay. The homeless community in Missoula, like any community, includes good people facing hard times, but also individuals who might exploit others' vulnerabilities. Did Melissa encounter someone with bad intentions? The fact that her belongings and remains ended up in a remote area of Sanders County could suggest an attempt to conceal her death. Perpetrators of homicide often try to hide victims' bodies in remote locations, hoping they won't be found or that by the time they are found, evidence will have been destroyed by time and the elements. This theory would explain several puzzling aspects of the case. Why Melissa ended up so far from Missoula. Why her remains were found in such a remote location. Why there was no contact with family after February 19th. Why it took so long for her to be found. However, without more information from investigators about the condition of the remains or any evidence of trauma, it's impossible to say whether foul play was involved. Theory 3. Involvement with dangerous individual or situation. Related to the foul play theory is the possibility that Melissa became involved, voluntarily or involuntarily, in a wreck and a nature situation. Montana, like many Western states, has struggled with drug trafficking and drug abuse problems. Interstate 90, which runs through this region, is a known drug trafficking corridor. Could Melissa have become involved with individuals connected to drug activity? This is speculation, and there's no public information suggesting Melissa was involved with drugs. But investigators examining her death would certainly consider whether her death might be connected to any criminal activity in the region. Theory 4. She left voluntarily, but met with misfortune. Perhaps Melissa had decided to leave Missoula for some reason. Maybe she'd heard about opportunities elsewhere. Maybe she was fleeing from something or someone. Maybe she'd simply decided she needed a change. If she hitchhiked or otherwise traveled toward St. Regis, she might have ended up in the area where her remains were found through a series of circumstances. Perhaps the person who gave her a ride dropped her off in an isolated area. Perhaps she decided to try to survive in the wilderness and failed. This theory would position her death as tragic misfortune rather than foul play. But it still leaves many questions unanswered. What do the physical evidence and timeline suggest? Let's consider what we know. The distance from Missoula to the discovery site is approximately 60 miles. That's not a casual walk. It would require transportation of some kind. The location where her remains were found is quite remote. It's not along a main road. It's not near obvious destinations. Getting there would require either someone specifically choosing to go to that remote area, someone being brought there by another person, someone becoming lost or disoriented and ending up there accidentally. The fact that her belongings, wallet, ID, pants, knife were found near Dolan Flats and the Clark Fork River Lodge close to, but apparently not in the exact same location as her remains, is interesting. Were these items discarded? Did they wash downstream in the river? Were they separated from Melissa's body by wildlife activity? The condition of her remains after approximately 4 to 5 years of exposure would have made determining cause of death very challenging. Soft tissue would have long since decomposed. Many types of trauma might not be evident in skeletal remains, unless there were obvious signs like gunshot wounds to bone, stab marks on ribs, or blunt force trauma to the skull. Determining if violence was involved would be difficult. The ongoing investigation, her death, is under investigation, which tells us that authorities have not closed this case. They continue to seek answers about what happened to Melissa Arnold. This ongoing investigation likely includes forensic analysis of the remains to determine, if possible, cause of death analysis of the belongings found in June 2022 review of any evidence collected from the scene where remains were found, interviews with anyone who might have information about Melissa's movements after February 19, 2018 review of traffic cameras, surveillance footage, or any other records that might show Melissa's movements, investigation of any individuals who might have had contact with Melissa around the time of her disappearance. The harsh reality of homeless victim cases. One harsh reality we must acknowledge is that cases involving homeless victims often face particular challenges in investigation and in generating public attention. Melissa's case didn't generate widespread national media coverage. There were no cable news specials, no viral social media campaigns beyond those organized by her family, no massive reward funds. This isn't unique to Melissa's case. It's a pattern seen across many cases involving homeless victims. This disparity in attention and resources can impact investigations. When a case generates significant public attention, tips pour in. People remember seeing something. Witnesses come forward. Pressure on law enforcement to solve the case intensifies. For cases like Melissa's, investigators do their jobs professionally, but without the same level of public engagement and attention. Some of those tips and witnesses might never materialize. As of November 2025, more than 7 years after Melissa Tier disappeared from the Poverello Center in Missoula, and more than 2 years after her remains were identified, her case remains open and under investigation. The Arnold family has their answer to one question. They know what happened to Melissa, in the sense that they know she died and where her remains were found. But they don't have answers to the questions that likely haunt them still. How did she end up in Sanders County? What happened to her in those final hours or days? Did she suffer? Was someone responsible for her death, or was it a tragic accident? These questions matter. They matter to Melissa's family, who deserve to understand what happened to their loved one. They matter for justice, if someone was responsible for Melissa's death. And they matter for the broader community, particularly the vulnerable homeless population, who need to know if there's someone dangerous out there. Melissa Arnold's case highlights several important issues that deserve attention. The vulnerability of the homeless population. In January 2018, a community-wide survey found that the city of Missoula had 293 homeless individuals, representing 23% of the estimated total homeless population in Montana. These individuals face elevated risks of violence, exploitation, and death. Melissa wasn't an anonymous face in a crowd. She had a family who loved her. She had a father who helped support her. She had a sister who remembered her kindness and adventurousness. But her homelessness placed her in a position of vulnerability that may have contributed to her death. The challenge of missing persons investigations involving the homeless. When Melissa disappeared, crucial time elapsed before she was reported missing. This isn't anyone's fault. It's a reflection of the reality that homeless individuals often have irregular contact patterns and may go days or weeks without checking in. But those lost weeks made the investigation significantly more challenging. By the time police were looking for Melissa, the trail was already cold. The need for better systems. Should there be better systems for tracking the welfare of vulnerable homeless individuals? Should there be more frequent check-ins or accountability systems? These are difficult questions that balance personal freedom and autonomy with safety concerns. The Poverello Center and similar shelters do remarkable work with limited resources. They're not prisons or tracking facilities. They're emergency shelters trying to provide basic services to people in crisis. Expecting them to also function as monitoring systems is unrealistic given their resources and mission. But Melissa's case demonstrates the deadly risk that exists when vulnerable. People can disappear without immediate alarm bells ringing. What happens next? The investigation into Melissa's death continues. Detectives may still be following leads, reviewing evidence, or waiting for forensic results. Cases can take years to resolve, especially when dealing with skeletal remains and limited evidence. If you have any information about Melissa Arnold's case, please contact the Missoula Police Department. Even the smallest detail. Maybe you saw her after February 19, 2018. Maybe you gave her a ride. Maybe you know something about what happened could be crucial. Remembering Melissa, it's easy. In a case like this, to get caught up in the mystery, the theories, and the unanswered questions. But we must remember that this case isn't just a puzzle to solve. It's a human tragedy. Melissa Ruth Arnold was a real person. Her sister remembers her as caring, adventurous, and a good cook. She had childhood memories, family bonds, a life that mattered. Her homelessness doesn't define her worth as a human being. Her death deserves the same attention, the same investigative rigor, the same public concern as anyone else's. For over 4 years, Melissa lay in the Montana wilderness undiscovered. Her family searched and waited and hoped. When her remains were finally found and identified, it brought some closure, but also new pain and new questions. The investigation continues. Perhaps someday we'll have answers to how and why Melissa ended up in that remote spot in Sanders County. Perhaps someone will come forward with information. Perhaps forensic evidence will reveal what happened. Until then, Melissa's case stands as a reminder of the invisible people in our communities, those experiencing homelessness, those struggling on the margins, those who can disappear and sometimes not be missed right away.